Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the New World Podcast. I know the thumbnail says that we'll be covering psychedelics in this episode. However, after recording it, we realized that it was too long, so we're splitting it into two parts. So this episode, which we will consider part 1, covers the war on drugs, the history of the Opium Exclusion Act, and legalization versus decriminalization. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode and stay tuned for part 2 in a couple of days. 2020 was a tumultuous year. The question we must all ask going forward is simple. What values, ethics, and behaviors from the old world are we going to preserve? And what new perspectives are we going to embrace as we build our future civilizations? This is the New World Podcast with Ariz Kaki and Akil Samji.
Welcome back to another episode of the New World Podcast. I'm Ariz and this is Akil. And as we mentioned in our social media promotion, this episode is going to be an introduction on psychedelics, the world and the community of psychedelic research. But we're also going to be focusing on the war on drugs. And many people might be asking, like, okay, why do you have to focus on the war on drugs and psychedelics? We would like to actually look at how the governments of the world actually came together and declared a so-called quote-unquote war on drugs. We're going to look into this specifically by looking at how people actually charge for these drugs, where the motivation came from, and what was the sort of timeline of somehow some drugs becoming decriminalized and legalized, which will go through that terminology as well. And it can be kind of confusing depending on the region as to which drugs are legal and which drugs are not legal. So we're going to go through that entire dichotomy. We're going to look at a bit of the history on the war on drugs. We're going to look at other types of periods of prohibition and why we should be calling for the end of the war on drugs. And more importantly, how the promising research of psychedelic research could also lift up more bans on other types of psychedelics in the future, which can potentially have pros and cons. And so we'll let the audience decide for that. And now ultimately, let's also mention the fact that we're going to have more episodes with certain experts coming up soon with regards to psychedelic research. For those of you that are interested, don't take our professional word for it. We're actually giving you guys the intuition. We actually learned ourselves from this guest and from doing our own research. So we're going to guide you through and communicate to you exactly the sort of complex research that we went through, because we went through a bunch of research papers and articles and think tank research with citations as well. So also we're going to provide citation at the end as well. So in the description. So if you want to check those out specifically, you guys can, if you have an interest. We have compiled it from a wide range of resources. So it's not really like one sort of bias from another.
Yeah. So now we move on to the war on drugs. But before I get into the whole history behind it, I just want to give you guys some context into how popular it was back then. So just to give you guys some context into it, the Sears catalog in 1890 sold syringes and opioids like morphine for $1.50, which in today's money is $30. But it's crazy to think how you could just simply open a magazine and order drugs to your house and get it mailed to you. But yeah.
Yeah, it's weird because it's like Sears. You think of all places, like something so mainstream as Sears actually selling like opiates, like just great opiates. I don't know. It's weird. Strange.
And in the United States particularly, because I found this on a Harvard paper, so that's what they were focusing on. I saw the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, which was based in 1909, and the Harrison Act of 1914, which regulated the sale of opioids, taxed the production, importation, and distribution of it. And going into the history now, at the time, many Chinese Americans were using opioids, and that was the reason for the regulation. So there were a lot of racist connotations behind it.
Yeah, especially because the fact that majority of some of the laws that we're going to be talking about, some of the initiatives are sort of disproportionately affecting one group over another. And it could be a variety range of causes, but obviously not saying that this is the only cause. But similarly, at the same time, there's like sort of a cause and effect criteria. It doesn't necessarily have to be the intention of the original law. Like the law didn't have to intend to affect a particular group, but because disproportionately that group made up the majority of users of any type of drug, you have eventually what we're going to be covering later on with especially the modern actual war on drugs, which started in the 1970s. Akil here just giving you the context of like the scene of actual like drug warfare and where this idea came from. Like who thought of the idea that the government should step in, and who like what was the actual like social and cultural norms behind with drugs? Like when did this thing become like a bad thing?
Exactly. So I just want to give you guys some context into this Opium Exclusion Act, because it gives you an understanding into why there were so many racist connotations towards them. So starting in the late 1850s, there was a gold rush in California, and a lot of immigrants from East Asia, particularly China, migrated there to take part in that. And so they were used as cheap labor to build railroads because employers could pay them whatever they wanted to since they weren't real Americans, right? And at the same time, there was opium wars led by the British in the 1840s and 50s. So the opium wars were when Britain went into China and started selling opioids to Chinese people. And when the government found out, they got mad and started telling these British merchants to close down. And they didn't, and they ended up having a war twice. But because of that, the British were giving bad propaganda and stating that the Chinese people were using opioids. And to the Americans, they were believing it at that time. And so they connotated opioids with Chinese people. And then at the same time, later on, there was a long depression from 1873 to 1879. And now Americans are slowly losing jobs, but Chinese people in America still have them because the employers are paying them basically nothing.
Yeah. So which just suppose that to something that is a more sort of unrelated, which is this idea that like, because the Chinese Americans weren't actually considered Americans, nor did they have any documents. This is prior to the whole like regulation era. Like there were really no like Department of Labor or whatever.
Yeah.
So like this is what happens when you undergird like the people who are domestically there with like an immigrant group that's sort of used as proxy by these companies to sort of have cheaper labor without any regulation or whatever. And it just prices the domestic, I guess, citizens of the country out of the market. That's why you have things like this. So this is like sort of a constant thing that you kind of see modernly with like free trade. It was just something interesting.
And so Americans were slowly getting mad at the Chinese people and blaming them for Americans not having jobs when it wasn't really their fault. And then in 1862, California put a head tax on them. So every Chinese person that was in America basically had to pay tax for being there. Then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act came in the United States to ban immigration from China, because the United States were using the fact that since they were smoking opioids and drugs were causing a lot of problems, they should ban immigration from there, along with the whole workforce and what Aris mentioned. But then at the same time, during the First World War, soldiers started using opiums to treat injuries. And as a result, some people got opioid addictions or even died. And people back in America started using natural remedies, which had opioids and drugs like cocaine or heroin, but they weren't labeled on the front because they were considered natural at the time. And so people started getting opium addictions from there. And so as a result, and on top of that, the German company Bayer started to sell heroin as a non-addictive substitute for morphine.
Which is kind of
but basically because people were getting addicted to opioids, they constantly kept blaming it on the Chinese people. And so as a result, many states started to ban opium use, and that led to the 1909 Smoking Opium Exclusion Act. But then the funny thing is, I guess the United States was getting so much revenue off of the sale of opioids that in 1914, a mere 8 years later, the Harrison Act was made to regulate it, which is they started taxing it, and they essentially helped the country make money off of it.
Yeah, and eventually you had like big pharma come in later on, become an actual private sector company. Yeah. And in reality, it was sort of controlled by governments. Yeah, and I think this goes back to something that we mentioned in the beginning of this episode, which is a lot of the connotation of like drugs are bad is true in the sense that drugs, like anything else, like drugs or like pharmacological solutions to disease or to treating any sort of ailment, at the same time, certain doses, microdosing, anything you overdose on, of course, it's considered it entirely can lead to horrible consequences, i.e. death or massive injury or brain injury as well. And so people just in the psychedelic space, particularly, as we mentioned in the previous, the last episode that we had on mental health, is that psychedelics as a sort of subset of psychoactive drugs in the pharmacological whole toolkit of how to treat some of these drugs is showing more promise compared to the current standard. But before we go to that, I sort of want to mention the fact that like this idea of all drugs are bad, kind of grouping them all together, sort of comes to the idea that people don't take nuance anymore, never took nuance, particularly around that era, especially when you get into the late 60s and then early 70s. Because what happens around that time, and I think we've spoken about it in previous episodes, is that this era of like counterculture and the anti-Vietnam War movement, hippies essentially, are associated with the massive use of some of these psychedelic substances. Now, psychedelics research actually flourished after World War II, particularly in the 50s and early 60s. So remember, you can say that Vietnam started in 1964. The so-called the continuity year that really everything kind of became like a cluster was around 1968 to like your 1972, which are sort of the hippie years, essentially, where you have like a lot of the so-called protests and rioting in some of America's biggest cities. And so this idea of research was kind of stayed within academia, particularly in the government. So you had the government academia pipeline that was kind of experimenting with some of these drugs. You had LSD, you had some of the acid or ecstasy, you have some of these drugs that are kind of being pharmacologically made and synthesized in labs, and then people are sort of being they were experimenting on mice, experimenting on people, which again is another entire episode, because there's an entire whole ethics issue with something called Project MK Ultra, which was led by the CIA in the 50s and 60s to kind of actually experiment using LSD and some of these substances on people, on Americans themselves, without their even consent. And the idea was because it was a Cold War, the CIA was using this behind so-called federal taxpayers or even judiciary oversight committees or whatever the case may be. Probably even the presidents at some points didn't even know that the CIA was using some of these psychoactive drugs that were still in process, and it was still like there was no history behind them, there's no precedence behind them, but they were being used because of some of their psychoactive properties and some of their properties to, i.e., brainwash or to so-called mind control. So that was kind of like an entire different side thing, but it's something interesting to know that it was in academia at the time. And so the idea was that these drugs began to get released into the crowd, and with the whole hippie movement, with the counterculture movement, you sort of have a bunch of themes rising, particularly in the idea that hippies are associated with like the progress of civil rights. But at the same time, there's also another thing associated with some of these people, which is this idea of openness, right? You have a lot of openness coming out of the 60s. This included the idea of like the contraceptive pill. So sex became no longer something that's confined to something in a marriage or something institutionalized, whether it can happen between any two individuals based off a transaction, quote unquote, with the ability of some sort of biomedical advancement that regulated menstrual cycles. So this was like one gigantic step in this whole process. And then you had addition with like psychoactive drugs, and you had the so-called idea of community and living communitarianly. And so you had this like cultural shift in America. And essentially what happened was these psychoactive drugs became the hallmark of what hippies stereotypically are portrayed on TV. Yeah. And so around 1970 or late 60s, early 70s, you have a president, we've spoken about him before with the banking episode with regards to central banks, but Richard Nixon in 1970 decided to put a ban by the U.S. government, enforced by the U.S. government on psychedelic drugs, but more so a bigger umbrella term, which we called the war on drugs. So the war on drugs, the idea was to crack down on some of these drugs that were causing havoc and crime in some of America's big inner cities, urban areas. But at the same time, subsequently, there's more evidence to prove. In our next episode, we've spoken to a psychedelic expert who kind of goes into depth about some of the motivations behind cracking down on psychedelic research specifically as a sort of bigger part of a bigger plot to kind of have a war on drugs. And the idea was that the psychedelics were specifically being used by hippies, which could have been deemed to be politically damaging to Richard Nixon in his re-election years. And so this idea was that the U.S. government decided to ban psychedelics, and so utilizing the war on drugs, utilizing something called the DEA. And many of you guys might have heard about this, but this is a federal agency that is responsible in the United States to centralize and to enforce drug control laws that were passed by the government at the time. And so remember, some of these laws often, because disproportionately were affected by ethnic minorities at the time, were targeting America's urban cities, i.e. your African-American populations, your Latino populations. But at the same time, you were also targeting hippies from the psychedelics, which were mostly your middle class, your children of the sort of silent generation that went to World War II, your boomers, essentially, your boomer white generation that were also being targeted. And so, like I said, this was a multifaceted project. And so you have to kind of understand the different types of avenues in which some of these centralized planners were trying to use and to shut down some of this promising, but at the same time, there's also damaging repercussions. And so many people argue as to whether or not the war on drugs was justified or not, or some parts of it are justified. Now, be careful. We're not endorsing or saying anything that like, we're talking like cocaine and the opiates that we're having. Like, these are all perfect drugs. These are all perfectly normal drugs, and it's okay for everyone to have it. Like, no, that's not what we're saying at all. We have our personal opinions on it. But all we're saying is the fact that like sometimes there's not nuance. The fact that psychedelic research has been thrown into the lump with the war on drugs to kind of shut down research had thrown the entire research pipeline back decades, right? It's only until more recently, for the past like 2 decades or so, that people have been getting to pick up the research and it's moving into the private sector. Before, it was stuck in academia. There's plenty of research happening in academia. It's just that we know when things get into the private sector, you're getting more competition, you're getting more abilities to apply these drugs in various people's lives. So going on, we have certain communities that are affected, and the war on drugs essentially does a trickle effect. So basically, this is what happens. You have a particular drug that affects a particular community. So if you think of the crack cocaine epidemic that affected the African American community disproportionately, you have things like the war on drugs and some of these policies that empowered big government police to kind of come in there and kind of disproportionately jail and imprison and incarcerate African Americans more over than their white counterparts, more so over in any other ethnic group. And so, like you said, it could be because the usage in these communities was higher, and that could be associated with economic. They were deprived of economic opportunities. Like we said, this only a few years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. So there was kind of just the small baby steps that the African American community was taking to kind of get back up to par on the economic scale. So you have to understand that there's a lot of causes and effects. So, like we mentioned before, all these bills and these policies, we kind of at this point, after doing a lot of research, we kind of see why the problems are, that the fact that the whole prison industrial complex even exists. For those of you that don't know what that is, that's the argument that a lot of people have been making. The fact that the police, but more so the state, has jailed more people, not just of color, but in general, the idea that the United States and more people just are being jailed for non-offensive drug crime, non-offensive related, just transporting drugs or having a particular amount of weight on them at the time that they're caught, and being jailed like life offenses. And so this is a sort of talking point that we've heard. And I think this is one of the biggest areas I think that people could improve on more recently. Before we get into the scientific and STEM pipeline, I think if it comes from a policy perspective, it'll be easier to sort of understand that some of these like punishments and these, I guess, these punishments are just disproportionately, like they're not proportional to the crime. Right?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the whole unjustification, the racist connotations of these laws. Because I know I was reading a fact, I might be wrong, but back when they made the cocaine laws, they were saying that black people, or like African Americans, were more disproportionately affected by these because the penalty for carrying crack cocaine, which African Americans mostly had, was I believe 10 or 100 times worse than the penalty for powder cocaine, which mostly white people were carrying. And so you could see the kind of racist connotation, even if it was indirect, it still was there.
And it's the idea that the data presented itself that way. It's not the fact that the cause was the effect, right? Rather, as well, it's sort of the manifestation of the data, because many have also argued in other papers the fact that because cocaine is a higher grade drug, it costs more money. We all knew that white Americans at the time, but per capita family income probably had a higher income than African American families were, and therefore African American communities were resorted to cheaper alternatives like crack cocaine, which were even more damaging and resulted in policing much more prevalent over there. But anyways, moving on. Some of the ideas that these policies have, including the cocaine crack period, as we spoke about, but more recently with the 1994 crime bill that many people have heard, this idea that like these communities that were racialized essentially were targeted for higher crimes. And it's a domino effect, as I mentioned, right? You introduce a particular drug into a community, ethnic community or any community, you then build policies around that community, you declare a war on drugs, you fill that community, and the police departments and the state and local governments immense powers over people and infringing often upon minority rights, imprisoning them, and then creating a pipeline, right? This idea of the school to prison pipeline in some of these inner cities is a direct result of some of these policies in which minor offenses are given lifelong jail penalties. And this essentially does a lot of things, because if you're going to imprison a father or a mother, you're essentially breaking apart one entire family unit. Now do that on a scale, give it to an objective of like 1,000 times. You're essentially breaking apart a bunch of families. Indirectly, you're breaking apart an entire community. Indirectly, you're removing, if that person was a sole earner, you're removing the property tax income. You're removing the taxes that go to that regular school. You're going to then force politicians and other special interest groups like unions to kind of come in and do their part in there. So you have this so-called domino effect that we can see the effects of it until today, where some communities have a massive disparity. Just walk into a community and you see, like visually speaking, like you see one has a totally different tone, look to it than something like maybe just, I don't know, a few roads down that might be a bit more gated, has housing, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And even going back to the whole war on drugs, you end up affecting the ways people create these drugs too, because the supply and the demand is still there. And I remember we were watching a video recently talking about the supply and demand, which also goes back to the whole banking episode too. But essentially, when you drop the supply or you start restricting the supply, but the demand is still up, even though the price goes higher, people are still willing to pay. And as a result, more people are willing to give it to those people through more illegal ways, which is how you see the whole mobs and the cartels start being formed.
And speaking of that, before we get into that, I just want to give you a few stats. So in 1980, around 580,000 people were arrested on drug-related charges in the United States by 2014. So this is 34 years later. The number had increased to 1.5 million. More than 700,000 of those arrests in 2014 were related to marijuana use. In fact, nearly half of the 186,000 people serving time in federal prisons in the United States are incarcerated on drug-related charges. And this is from the Cato Institute. So we're going to cite this quote this entire paper, this article in the description. It's called Cato Institute's, the paper is called 4 Decades and Counting, the Continued Failure of the War on Drugs. And another stat, just to give you the fact that how absurd this is, and we're going to talk about this from a different angle, is the government side. So we know that the governments and certain leaders and political leaders have instituted this idea that if we just do a crackdown on drugs, we essentially will take taxpayer money, we would we would put it into a federal agency that would enforce something, crack down on it, make something totally illegal. And then anyone who has it in possession of it can be charged criminally. And then ultimately you have a sort of chain, a back and forth happening. So when government does this, like we said, it targets innocent people. It creates this massive imbalance. And then if a drug in particular has a quote unquote ability to kind of improve people's quality of life, you can build a market around it, right? You can build competition, regulation, privatization, different competitors coming in. Ultimately, the consumer benefits in the end of the day because prices get lower over time, right? And then you get access to those drugs to anyone in the world, similar to the idea of the mobile phone, right?
Exactly.
It used to be tools for the rich. Now, 40 years later, you have the ability, like transistors are being made at rapid rates, and you have rapid fast phones, you have data, you have network, you have broadband. And so like I said, the law of markets works over there. But the problem with something like this is that when government does this, they essentially create a monopoly. They've essentially built and empowered a monopoly in what Akil said, which is something like the cartels and the mobs that you saw in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And then you see with the cartels since 1980s, with the war on with the especially the cocaine epidemic in the United States and North America. And then more recently now that we're talking about the so-called opioid crisis that's affecting and plaguing North America now. So in terms of the monetary cost, this is a really interesting fact. The monetary cost of the United States domestic drug policy is equally remarkable. Since the war on drugs began more than 40 years ago, this is from 2017, by the way, the US government has spent more than $1 trillion on interdiction policies. Spending on the war continues to cost US taxpayers $51 billion annually. From this, again, from the Cato Institute, and it's the same paper. And so what you have to understand is that the war on drugs is being led by the United States government in relation to countries that are the biggest drug producing countries. So these include Mexico. Surprisingly enough, people don't realize this, but Afghanistan has a huge entire region of like opiate poppies, essentially the poppy fields. But Mexico, Colombia, etc., these countries that are so-called in North America and Central America that were empowered by so-called federal agencies and given the governments of these and the police and the militaries of these countries are given more weapons to fight and combat these cartels. And like we said, these cartels wouldn't exist in the first place or be empowered as much if the government didn't actually crack down on war on drugs. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what do you, psychedelics set aside, what about like harmful drugs? We know crack cocaine kills people. We know heroin kills people. We know opiates kill people. So are you guys saying that apart from psychedelics, the government shouldn't be cracking down on any drugs at all? The question is whether or not the policy, which has been in place for 45 years, is working or not, if it's effective. We saw a video recently where we said that the actual DEA's policy that had been set for 40 years, I think what was the efficacy rate was 1%. It was 1% efficacy. Means how effective was it? 1% in 40 years. So that should tell you something. If you're actually going to look at this from a scientific perspective, you presented a hypothesis. Okay, let's do a war on drugs. Okay, after 40 years, it's 1% effective. It's time to change something. Exactly. And the idea is 40 years ago, you didn't have organized cartels as you do today. So something happened to let those cartels know that it was okay to be a cartel. And it was most probably these weird policies that empowered the people to build these cartels. And so you might be thinking, wait, how do these cartels come along? And as Akil mentioned, when you're doing this, you're giving a monopoly to certain actors that are willing to pay the price to do risky business.
Exactly.
Everyone knows that when you have something illegal, if you schedule a drug, for example, you know you can get charged with it. You know that there's hefty crimes and punishment coming with it. You essentially price out most people. The people you have left are willing to take the higher risk. And these include violence, gun violence, organized crime. You're going to organize them even more. And so you have the rise of these cartels in Central America, and including with the mob. And with the mob, we're actually going to quickly move to prohibition. But like I said,
I just wanted to say one thing for you. With the war on drugs too, with the whole cartel thing, I know we were watching a video saying that the DEA tried to regulate some of the chemicals that are used to make these drugs. But what happens is these cartels are able to find a way to use more dangerous chemicals and more stronger chemicals to make these drugs, which in turn, when they sell it to people, they take the same amount and it results in more addiction or more overdose deaths because it's a stronger amount. And as a result, some people might even be able to lace it with deadly chemicals to kill people on purpose. And so by regulating it, just like, for example, I know here in Canada recently, marijuana was regulated. And I'm pretty sure now, if there were marijuana deaths from before by people lacing it and stuff, I'm pretty sure it's gone down because you can buy it legally now.
Yes, and the idea is that with marijuana legalization, which we're going to talk about in terms of psychedelic legalization, is a solution to some of these problems with the prison industrial complex, with some of these broken communities. And like I said, this goes way beyond just the drug and the crime, because when you have certain communities always being kind of pillaged and kind of always being looked at from a bird's eye view, like these communities don't develop. And then as a result, they don't develop education. You get where I'm going with this, employment, whatever, economic empowerment. But like I said, these encourage the cartelize, the term is cartelization of certain drugs. You're pushing entrance out of the market because there's no competition anymore. And those who say, like I said, are willing to consolidate power, but by any means necessary, violence, warfare, everything's on the table, including creating organized crime and a massive monopoly. And they now have a monopoly and they can increase prices. And as more people get addicted in the mainland, the more higher prices they're willing to pay because they're getting more violent. And then as a result, the government that initially declared the war on drugs is now going to become even tougher because now they have to go after the cartels, justifying their means to keep on continuing a war on drugs because now that there's a cartel here. Well, it's like you remove power from the cartels when you actually make something legalized because you can control it.
Exactly.
And like I said, the idea is that once you make something illegal, other things are also at the table too. This includes like restricted age because there's no age anymore because anyone cannot have it anymore. And even if they get caught, they go to jail. But the point being is that if you had it regulated and if you had it under your control, you could regulate to who you sold it to.
Yeah.
So like I said, there's a lot of nuance in the discussion. Like by no means are we offering any policy solution. We're just saying that like there's a lot of things that some people think is the right way to do things. It's that we just say maybe take another step and look into it in terms of how we can deal with some of the violence, decreasing the violence, B, decreasing the death from some of these drugs, and see how can we get the drugs off our street and maybe get the people who are addicted to these drugs to actually better quality rehabs and solutions and futuristic solutions of the 21st century, which we're going to talk about in the psychedelic area. But I just want to kind of quickly take a turn into prohibition because prohibition era in the 1920s and 30s kind of dealt with the idea of alcohol prohibition, right? And many people have learned that idea that around that time, post World War I, there was a push to kind of ban alcohol. And many of the people that believed in this time many people that believed this at the time were citing the idea that alcohol made people less productive. It broke apart families, communities, the same script. And the idea is that if the government simply just put a ban on alcohol, if communities and people rallied together on a ban of alcohol, then our societies could improve, etc. And you have to understand that alcohol at the time was being consumed en masse. So if you just legalize it like right away, you're going to have to fill that void with something else. But I just want to give you guys a few history pointers here. So in Canada, there was actually a national prohibition that was instituted from 1918 to 1920. But this was effectively due to the fact that World War I was going on. And so they wanted everyone's attention to fighting the war. But most provinces appealed the laws during the 1920s. Instead, introduced laws to kind of surround the restriction of sale of alcohol. So you probably have, if you live in Canada, you have crown corporations like LCBO, and the idea that you get alcohol from like government regulated and instituted agencies, and then government licenses it to other people for private sectors. But in America in particular, in 1919, you had something called the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act eventually morphed into what the United States called the 18th Amendment. An amendment is essentially amended the Constitution that essentially makes that amendment as powerful as the Constitution. And so the 18th Amendment was passed, basically ending the ability for people in America to manufacture. The presence of alcohol within America. You can still consume it, though. Yeah. And like we said, this rose in organized crime. This is where the whole mafia historical period comes to, the mafia, the mob, and how these guys were empowered simply because you made something illegal and you made it a commodity for them, a heavy commodity, because everyone relied on alcohol. Everyone needed alcohol because it was such a cultural thing to have. And so they were willing to do any means necessary to preserve that. And the mafia and the mob became wealthier as more and more people decided to go to them instead of the government, because they knew that the government wasn't going to give them anything. They would go to these people, these criminals in particular, to get their hit.
Yeah. And the funny thing I find about that is they banned the importation and the production in the United States, but you can still consume it. So the question is, where were you getting it from if you're consuming it, right?
And even if I think the idea was even if you produce alcohol prior to the prohibition period, you could still keep that sell it. And then there was a lot of these loopholes that if you were a doctor, you could still prescribe whiskey. Yeah. And so there's this joke that like whiskey prescriptions went through the roof because everyone knew that there were loopholes. So I'm saying like this idea that these blanket laws work is that it's one of the biggest debates, which is if something even is a law, and like no one's following it and then no one's enforcing it because you have this big pipeline, is it really considered a law? Right?
Exactly.
And so I think we can look to that in terms of any laws that we pass in the future with regards to our Gen Z listeners, is that whenever you think about something, understand that like even if it's a valid law, like does it make sense? Because it's just because someone signs a piece of paper, you need to have the enforcement agencies. If they're not willing to do it because it violates rights, or no one's getting paid, or whatever the case may be, is it still considered a law? I don't know. I don't think so. But here's another stat that you guys might want to listen to. So before Prohibition and the Harrison Narcotics Act, which Akil talked about for opiates in 1914, there have been over 4,000 federal convicts, nearly fewer than 3,000 of whom were housed in federal prisons. So by 1932, so this is a year before Prohibition ended, so before they removed the 18th Amendment, this is 12 years later, roughly speaking, a decade of the 20s, the number of federal convicts increased by 561% to 26,589 people. And the federal prison population had increased by 366%. Again, this is from Cato's Institute, but this is a second paper called Alcohol Prohibition Was a Failure. So like we mentioned, some of these stats speak for themselves, right? Something probably went wrong in your hypothesis and you sort of filled up the prison. Now, many people are saying, good, at least the people who illegally having it, they're in prison now, cool. But like we said, there's other problems associated with it because people were just going to consume alcohol, whether or not you did it or not. You flooded the Justice Department and the justice systems, and they moved away from trying things that actual criminals like murderers and killers and rapists. Instead, you focus on these petty misdemeanors, which we would call misdemeanors today, but you fill them up and you clogged up the system and the machine. So like I said, there's a lot of things that lead back and forth. And so which brings us to the concept of legalization versus decriminalization. So many of you guys, as you mentioned earlier, like what is a particular solution when it comes to opioids or cocaine or some of these other drugs that are now still considered illegal in some parts of the world? It's like the idea is that many people call for the decriminalization of many of these drugs. So like marijuana, for example, in the United States, there's been a call for a federal ban for decriminalization. I know certain states have not only decriminalized, but legalized it. So there's a private sector industry growing there. But in Canada, we have it completely legalized. You also have a private sector and you can also, and government also regulates it. So that's like on behalf of the government, the same people who want to shut it down, that's their incentive because they get taxed on it. But decriminalization, the term essentially means that there'll be no certain charge on a certain act, but still considered an illegal act. So if they caught you, you really can't, you're not a criminal. There's really no charge, but it's still considered illegal. So they would take it away from you. You essentially get rid of your, I guess, your stock at the moment.
You might have to pay a fine or something.
Right, but there's really nothing criminal. Like you're not going to be put into the jail pipeline, which essentially could remove a bunch of the convicts that are currently in U.S. federal prisons and reduce the amount of people going to jail for these stupid crimes in the first place by a massive scale. Because most people are not out there like in organized crime. Many of them actually have this on them. And their intention isn't to actually take someone's life or to disrupt their communities. Rather, they want to seek economic opportunities, right? And the second term is legalization, which means the law or the product that was previously not allowed or prohibited is no more restricted. So it's not even restricted anymore. The government can either regulate it based off other laws. So they basically remove that law and then they have regulations attached to the legalization of that. So for example, with Canada, you have a certain age, you legitimize and you legalize marijuana, but the government put in certain regulations, i.e. what age group can or can't take this, who can you sell it to, who can sell it. All these are like regulations that come after. And you don't make it restricted. So then you have private sector actors jump in. And who knows, like we said, with the law of markets and with science, with pharmacology, eventually you can come to a point where all the side effects of Akil mentioned, I haven't really looked into marijuana specifically, but if you had like synthetic marijuana, eventually one day, if there's a startup company that's looking at synthetic marijuana to administer to people who have pain, instead of giving them something like morphine, right, which is even worse, it's legal, big pharma, but morphine, which can be addictive. What if you just gave them synthetic marijuana that kind of reduced the addiction portion, but actually got the job done? Who knows, right? Exactly, so I'm saying. So there's a lot of potential behind these markets. So like we mentioned, the question we have to ask is, could decriminalizing certain drugs, such as the more harmful ones, be the solution to provide better solutions rather than a pipeline to prison for certain communities? And I think our answer is yes. Majority of even the middle drugs, like if you look at the opioid problem, the opioid epidemic, people believe that if you throw people in jail, that's going to end it. But in reality, you're putting addicts in jail. You're not solving the problem on the street. There's more addicts on the street. You're just going to keep them, finding them, you're going to arrest them, and they're going to go back to their ways, right? Yeah. And then even with rehab, it's like, how effective is the rehab treatment? How effective are the safe injection sites? The intermediate solution was a safe injection site. The idea that if we allowed them to use clean needles in a facility to satisfy the craving of addiction, we can then put them onto another pipeline of like, speaking with the counselor, making them more productive, getting them off the drug entirely, then becoming productive members of society. That's the current solution. But we want to sort of speak about the fact that maybe psychedelics, which has promising research behind it, could be a particular solution to not only drug addiction, but other mental health disorders, which are essentially, for most people, the main what they derive to consume these drugs in the first place. Yeah,
and a little bit of background on safe injection sites. The reason why they were created is because people who were taking opioids like heroin were using dirty needles and were getting diseases like HIV. And so with safe injection sites, they were able to regulate how much you take so you don't get overdose, and as well give you clean needles so you don't get diseases. And then like Ari said, you speak to a counselor and slowly start getting away from that addiction, slowly lessening your dose, like et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So, like we mentioned, the fact that the government keeps on cracking down on some of these drugs, particularly opiates. you're still enabling the cartels to go. They're still here.
Mhm.
And I think many people realize the best way to do it, either maybe regulating what comes into the country, sure, but while it's here, like how are we going to handle that solution?
Mhm.
And I think we can look towards the idea that people will always use loopholes in the laws
Mhm.
to kind of evade their way through. But the best way to look at it is the marijuana debate, which you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
The idea that for the longest time people were questioning as to not marijuana should be legal or not,
Mhm.
the ethics behind it, how effective it is it a bad drug, is it a good drug, whatever the case may be. Now, marijuana has been prescribed by the pharma industry for a while as an alternative to pain relief,
Mhm.
right? You smoke a joint, you kind of feel a bit relieved. And this is prior to the legalization in Canada for recreational marijuana.
Mhm.
And it just goes back to this idea that like with marijuana in particular, because the debate with marijuana the sort of debate that has been used, the talking points can be applied to basically every single legalization process of the drug.
Mhm.
And the idea for marijuana was, well, it has like a lot of good effects on like helping people. It's a better solution to kind of help in terms of remedies. And the recreational part where it's like where you have kind of like human rights, like people have the freedom to choose whatever the hell they want to do. And having a war on drugs for marijuana possession and for people smoking a joint is really stupid and putting people in jail for 35 years just for smoking a joint but not harming anyone in their own home, right? So those were the kind of talking points. And which brings us to the world of psychedelics.
Actually, I just wanted to go touch upon the stuff again. So, in my opinion, I just wanted to put this out there. I think solving this would be, in my opinion, would be better to do legalization over decriminalization. Just because with decriminalization, yes, there's no charge to it, but it still is illegal, and so you still have people creating it in their own ways and maybe lacing it to kill people. And even though it is legal, yes, you might pay a fine, but people will still continue to do it because they're getting paid a lot of money to transport it from one place to another. Versus, I think with legalization, yes, someone older can buy it and give it to someone younger, but at the same time, since it's regulated, there's nothing harmful in it. Like it's not laced with anything, so you're lessening the amount of overdoses and the deaths that are around, right? And so I think looking at it from a moral standpoint, legalization is the better output, but that's just my opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we're going to kind of shift gears. There's kind of a relation between the two topics, the reason why I put it together. But we're going to move on to the world of psychedelics. It's sort of an introduction, Psychedelics 101. But basically, many people have sort of heard this term being thrown around, especially in the more modern days, become more pop culturally relevant. Mm-hmm. It's always existed. These have existed for like a while, as you mentioned, the 60s. Yeah. But the idea of it being something more mainstream has basically been gaining popularity because of pop culture. There's a lot of pop culture icons that speak about psychedelics. Two of them in particular that comes to mind is Mike Tyson and Joe Rogan.
Also Snoop Dogg too.
Right, you talk about psychedelics in particular and their effects on them personally from anecdotal evidence of how it's helped them, which you can check out in your own time. But so let's sort of dissect the term. What does psychedelics mean? The term psychedelics refers to the idea of mind manifesting. And the source I got that from, by the way, was a TED Talk that we'll also link in the description, from a man named Rick Doblin. So we're going to talk about him in just a second. But before we get to him, like I said, mind manifesting in relation to a particular class of drugs, more like psychoactive drugs that are associated with the serotonin levels in the brain. So remember, serotonin is sort of your happy hormone, right? This idea of a reward system where the level of happiness and the level of, I guess, many have argued also the level of drive one has to accomplish certain goals. And often the consumption of any of these substances has been associated with the resultant state of euphoria. So like euphoria, this so-called like weird trippy high, not like a high in terms of like marijuana. This the whole term like tripping or trip is associated with the psychedelic realm because this idea of like an entire hallucination or hallucinogen or like a hallucination drug that builds an entire hallucination or a reality that's detached from objective reality. That's the idea of psychedelics. And so this idea of euphoria has been associated with consumption of some of these drugs. And the most commonly known drugs within the psychedelic space today, as I mentioned before, LSD, but there's plenty of other ones. The one in particular that's in the pipeline right now, actually, interestingly enough, for studies at Johns Hopkins and many of the universities, and actually some private sector companies are actually using this right now to do trials and eventually might get regulated, which is really good news actually for 2020 to 2021. This was a really big year for psychedelic legalization in terms of research from some of these agencies, federal agencies, but it's also allowed in the private sector space. So entrepreneurs are getting on this now. Mm-hmm. But psilocybin, for example, has been getting a lot of attention recently. There's also MDMA and DMT. Now, those ones are still on the fence probably because of the fact that like how powerful they are as psychoactive substances. Yeah. We don't know entirely things about them. Of course, there's more resources on the internet if you want to research, if you want to look at particular research papers and studies. But I know that MDMA is kind of being used, but a DMT is a whole different thing. But yeah, some of these substances, like I said, have been gaining popularity. And breakthrough research is being done right now on psychedelic therapies to treat particular sets of problems within the space. So let's go back for a second. In the 60s and 50s, when you had research in academia, people wanted to figure out what those psychoactive properties were. This idea of tripping, this high, this weird hallucinogen or this hallucinogenic state that's given as a result of that the individual experiences as a result of consumption of these drugs were of interest to scientists at the time. Like, why is this happening? But this is prior to the whole like whether or not this treats any like mental health damage. It's just something of interest, right, in the academic space. Then you have the hippie era, and as also mentioning, hippie era is also known as the sort of new age spiritual movement. You know, your stereotypical like lady with crystals, and this idea that psychedelics were used as sort of this transport drug to spirituality and this new age spiritual religion that kind of mixes the like Mother Earth drugs and like this kind of like stereotype. But this was sort of the idea that these drugs that once they got into the streets, which was sort of the epitome of the ability for some of these academics to continue the research. This is what was associated with as a spiritual experience. All of these anecdotes that are coming out of people who utilize some of these substances are saying that there's a huge spiritual anecdote that comes out of it. It's like going to some sort of greater than themselves journey, right? This idea. So many of these psychedelic drugs in particular that have been associated for the longest time have been the con has been with these things, is that people have some of them have experienced amazing results as of going on this sort of spiritual journey, whatever the case may be. But others have also had bad trips, which have been sort of classified as the idea that like some people consume a particular amount of drug, and this could be on the street. Like I said, there's a difference between this, as we mentioned, because of the war on drugs, the street ones and the actual like pure ones synthetically derived from the source, or synthetic ones that are built in a lab, which you could argue are also bad. But like what I'm saying is there's a difference between what you get on the street, right? But like I said, the current model of what we are using right now to treat some of these disorders are psychiatric drugs. So there's a difference: psychedelic substances and then psychiatric drugs. So psychiatry, psychologists, whatever the case may be. Now, the biggest one, as I mentioned earlier, is that the breakthrough research is being happening in problems like PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, clinical depression. So this is actually like diagnosed by the doctor, like your little serotonin levels are too low, like your body literally cannot synthesize, or the ability for your neurotransmitter serotonin to exist in your brain at high levels, optimal levels, or normal average levels is impossible. And so you're clinically depressed. And then substance abuse, which we spoke about earlier. And surprisingly enough, many of you guys might be surprised, but there's many research studies being done right now on whether or not psychedelics, I'm not sure exactly which one it is. I'm pretty sure psilocybin, because that's the one that's being in the pipeline right now, can be used to treat alcoholism. Instead of like the classic rehab model and people relapsing. And many people are wondering, is this because psychedelics have this compound is unique and that some of its properties can do the same thing and like some of these other drugs can't? Well, people relate the ability for some of these people, for example, with the alcohol study, to get off of alcohol because of the spiritual thing. So we don't really know exactly what's going on, but these drugs do work. There's promising research behind them. And so let's go to the fact that the problem that it's solving: mental health disorders. As we spoke about on a previous episode, we spoke about psychedelics as the last portion of our episode. We also spoke about the fact that it treats clinical depression, substance abuse, and PTSD. Now, currently speaking, you have a psychiatric model, which more so over is a general Western medicine model that we've sort of been having for the past couple of decades. Prior to like innovation in medicine, and this is for all healthcare, by the way. Like if we set aside mental health care as like a subset of healthcare in the West, the idea is that it's more reactive. So like, I'm pretty sure the scenario sounds familiar. Like you get sick, for example, you feel like you're coming down with something, you go to the doctor, the doctor asks you what your symptoms are. And based off the symptoms that he or she has studied in medical school, they perform a diagnosis that you have a particular case. And then based off your personal markers, whether it be genetic or whatever the case may be at the moment, your doctor prescribes you either a medicine or a particular series of steps of solution that you could follow to get better from this. This can be ranging from like, if it's a viral infection, you get like or if it's a bacterial infection, you get your antibiotics, viral, you get medicine. So like there's many different solutions to this, right? You have your common cold, COVID, whatever the case may be. But that idea is what we call a reactive idea. So something has to happen to the individual for the individual to be then told to like that, for that person to then go to seek help. And this is changing now in majority of other parts of healthcare. So for example, other innovation that we've seen, if you've actually seen our episode with Melissa, who happened to be a biomechanical engineer, she looked into the fact that the biggest thing that's happening in prosthetic medicine and with something like surgical tools and surgical analysis, surgical planning, one of the things that the medical system and healthcare as an industry is moving towards is this whole called one size fits all reactive solution to a more personalized, proactive solution. Very personalized. We're talking the ability to kind of take the most minute details into consideration. And so this is happening to healthcare across the board. Now, as we know, healthcare ranges from everything. You have the genomic diseases, you have genomic studies with CRISPR-Cas, with those gene editing technologies. You have your, as Melissa mentioned, 3D surgical planning and simulation technology. And then you have like the mental health space. With the mental health space essentially has always lagged back. You know that for a fact, because on a mental health episode, we sort of spoke about the idea of like a stigma still kind of remaining. And you have to understand that there's still stigma about something, you're kind of far behind, because no one has a stigma on cancer. Like, let's be honest, we know cancer exists, but people still have a stigma on mental health. And so this kind of doesn't push into the forefront, right? And so we're always a step behind. And so with mental health, we know it's always been reactive, right? People feel depressed. And some of the current models is the psychiatric one, which is the doctor basically prescribed. This is sort of the ethical argument, is that, and many people believe this is sort of problem. Some of these drugs like morphine and whatever, is it highly addictive, and big pharma makes them, and there's perverse incentives. But with depression, especially the idea of antidepressants, right? These drugs that are provided to you by your doctor from this biomanufacturer and tells you, okay, take these, you have to take these daily in order to stay at a particular normal rate. So not even exceeding, like you're at normal, just to kind of get by. And like I said, it goes back to this idea of a reactive model. We have to sit back and anticipate what will happen and then thus formulate solutions. But instead, a lot of this new space in healthcare, but more so in mental health with psychedelic research, is sort of taking this proactive kind of look towards resolving some of these problems. Now, like we said, this pharmacological drug helps borderline to kind of keep you sane. Let's use a better choice of words. But this idea that like people trust big pharma, these pharmaceutical companies have our best interests at heart when they're operating on weird incentives, along with the massive medical industrial complex, doctors included, and people who actually certify these drugs to doctors, is this model that we've sort of been reconsidering, which is it good to kind of, keep on giving pills and here, like you're just sick, like, oh, we take more morphine. So do I really need it? So these questions have been happening in healthcare. And so with mental health, you initially had your mindfulness space, right? You had your meditation, you had the initial industries come out, which is, let's talk about it. Just don't jump, don't jump to the doctor. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, like stop for the drugs, like wait and let's see what's going on.
Yeah, you might be having, and then because we spoke about it, many people realize that like depression isn't just a clinical thing. Like depression is just a state of being. Like people have a depressive state, right? At the moment you have your ups and downs in life. And I think many people didn't realize that like, holy shit, I'm not like depressed. Like I'm just going through mental health at the moment. And a mental health crisis, as we know, the majority of people will go through, is the actual crisis in and of itself, a crisis where you have a problem that needs to be treated. And so now we're having this ability to kind of converse with people, meditation, mindfulness, and then now we're moving over to actual scientific solution, which is a psychedelic, which is in the realm essentially of psychedelics. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Check us out for an audio-only experience on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other outlets. Follow us on all of our social media, and please consider supporting us on Patreon. All of these links will be in the description. That's it for us today. Welcome to the New World.